Bem-vindos. Eu vou passar para inglês em respeito ao professor Robert Merton, mas bem-vindos todos. And switching to English, welcome everybody. I'm Rodrigo Soares. I'm the Vice President of Academic Affairs here at Insper. I'm an economist as well, so I'm delighted really to welcome you all and Professor Robert Merton to this day at Insper. We're abusing a little bit of his time, or maybe more than a little bit, so he's delivering our lecture now and later on also talking at the anniversary of our professional masters in economics. So I'm gonna leave it to Rui to present properly Professor Robert Merton. But I mean, very quickly, Professor Merton is the 1997 Nobel Prize winner. He's one of the founding fathers of modern financial economics. And we're really super delighted to have him here today. I think this is a very special year for Insper. We are celebrating 25 years of our undergraduate program. And more specifically related to this day, we're celebrating 20 years of our professional masters in economics. And we are in the midst of a series of celebrations. A couple of weeks ago, we had a conference in honoring José Alexander Sheikman. A couple of weeks from today, we're going to have also Esther Duflo coming to talk a little bit about development and randomized experiments in economics, and to have Professor Merton here to celebrate specifically the 20 years of our professional masters is really an honor to all of us, right? So I want to thank specifically the Center for Research in Finance and Macroeconomics in the figure of Rui Ribeiro here, and also our professional masters in the figure of Paulo Sérgio, who's here as well, who's gonna talk later. And welcome. I'm sure we're going to have an amazing lecture and a very nice day with Professor Merton. Rui, please.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Good afternoon, everybody. Very pleased to have you all here. I just want to say a few words before we get started. First, just in terms of organization, we're going to have a presentation by Professor Merton, followed by a Q&A, panel discussion with our guest speakers. Before we get started, I just want to say a few words, a few thank yous to everybody that helped put this together. Patricia and everybody from the events team, they've done great work. Ellen, Rosalia, and the team, everybody from the research team. I'd like everyone to say thank you to you because you did amazing work here putting this together. I guess we already mentioned Paulo Ribeiro, the coordinator of the master's program here. of course, he was the one actually that put everything together. But we had help from a lot of people like Alexandre Vitorino, Eduardo Andrade, and I should mention then, thank you as well to the CFA Society. I don't know if Marcia, Everton, and Faiga are here, but thank you very much. Hi, Everton. Thank you very much for once again partnering here with Insper. We hope to do a lot of events together in the future. To the Brazilian Finance Society as well. I don't know if Marcelo Fernandez is here, but I would like to say a thank you. Of course, we should acknowledge the support by firms that are also innovators in the field. We were talking about financial innovation here, so it's a great pleasure to have the support from Constância, Stone, and XP. So we have a great panel here with Arthur Wishman, CIO at XP, Rogério Oliveira, CIO at Constância, and Vinicius Carrasco from Stone, Chief Economist at Stone. So it's great to have you all here as well. And I just want to say a few words about Professor Merton. I guess Rodrigo already made an introduction. He's a professor of finance, distinguished professor of finance at MIT, emeritus professor at Harvard, and of course, Nobel Prize winner in economics. I don't know, I could spend hours talking about your contributions to finance, and I don't know how many times I cite your name when I teach classes in finance, so like I could spend hours talking about you. Your contributions to option pricing, intertemporal CAPM, the Merton model in credit, but I don't know, there are so many things to talk about you, but nobody wants to hear me. I guess they want to listen to you. So I just want to ask everyone to give a warm welcome to Professor Merton.
Well, thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. If I were a truly rational man, capital R, capital M, after those kind words, I'd just sit down and let things go. But thank you also for the invitation to come, and thank you all for coming to listen. So let's get started. I look at the time. I'm going to try to keep on time, so I'm calibrated. As you can see from the title, Evolution of Finance, Financial Innovation, you're getting it, among other things, from someone who lived through most of it. So, I was there, so maybe that makes it a little more fun, certainly for me. Are you hearing me all right? Oh, okay, good. So that's clear, but, you're in finance or close by, whether they in practice or research or both. It would be very essential to go and understand your past history of our field. But I want to accomplish a bit more this morning because I want to emphasize that this profession that we are all in is very important to society in general. There are some subjects that only those in it can really appreciate, but this is not one of them. So one of my agenda items in my talk today is to demonstrate, by going through history and then looking to the future, the role finance plays in a much broader sense for society at large. The idea that there's a difference or a dichotomy between the financial economy and the real economy, sometimes jargon, Wall Street, Main Street. I don't like that, but that's what's done. Okay, to treat them as dichotomy is, in my view, completely wrong. I think you'll only find that now in some out-of-date macro textbooks. But whether it's you or not, I want to see that they are inexorably linked together, and to act as if they're separated doesn't, in most cases, do much good. Finance, a well-functioning financial system is essential to economic growth, development, and stability. I'm not going to go through all the citations on that, but I would just mention two. I'm sure you know the names. Douglas North, Nobel Prize winner in economic history and so forth, and his work documenting the importance of both the financial and the legal system in actual economic development and growth and how important that is. Robert Solow, I was a student of his, colleague, and so forth, but Robert Solow's work on growth, in which he demonstrated that it was technological progress, not the traditional frugality of saving or population growth, although those two affect it, but technological progress which matters. But I remind you, the technological progress developed either in my school at MIT and its fabulous labs, or here at Insper and your engineering work and so forth. If that technological progress doesn't get into the economy, you'll never see the impact on growth. And it's finance that is needed to make that transition. Okay, now, so that's where I wanted to start with. Now, crises, as we all know, can sometimes slow down or even reverse financial innovation. Financial innovation, by the way, is the way in which the economic system gets better. So that's pretty important. And I would mention also that the driver of innovation, I think of three items. Finance science, we understand finance better. And once we understand it better, we use that knowledge to make improvements. Second, of course, is technology, all right? The enabler to do the things that we would like to do. But third is need. If there isn't a sense of need, wonderful technology, wonderful science will not likely get implemented, at least until there's a sense of need. We have all three today in spades. So if I could get going and say it, I said in the cases of crisis, we talked about innovations, as you know, in the great financial crisis of 2008-9, it tended to slow down or even in some cases reverse. But that isn't always true in crisis. Don't generalize if that's your experience that you know. It can go quite the opposite, as I will show you. And of course, I mentioned finance science. Finance has been around forever and very important. But as a science, I would say it really began in 1952 with the work of Harry Markowitz on creating portfolio selection and a systematic approach to it and identifying risk and so forth. Prior to that, it was largely a set of what I would call anecdotes, accounting identities, rules of thumb, all useful, but not a science. And most important, no data. It's hard for you to believe when you have now today trillions of megabytes of stuff coming along, but there was none at the time. So, when did it become a science? I would say beginning in that time. So let me move ahead, because I want to show you how science got incorporated into practice. All right, very briefly, this is a quick history of the period of science development, beginning with Markowitz, not so much as the founder of finance science, but certainly there at the beginning and found the foundation. I definitely would mark it there. And I have up here, you'll recognize a lot of the names there, people you've done. I'm not going to go through them with you, but these were really important contributions across all the aspects of finance, setting the principles and foundations that still hold well till today. And this, by the end of the 60s, I would say it was definitely a science. And what I mean by that is it had a set of principles developed, theories, hypotheses, and it had, very importantly, lots of data, at least relative to history. Chris did that for us in Chicago, and that changed the organization. You can't have a science without data to test it and data to suggest new hypotheses. So by the end of the 60s, it was a science. However, even though there was some uses of it in practice, reality was that it had very little impact on the mainstream finance practice. So it was well-developed science, but not there. That was going to change, and it did change when we came to the 1970s. And what happened in the 70s is, this is US-oriented because that's where it happened, and the US financial system is globally influential, but it quickly spread around the world. And there were a series of shocks, economic and financial shocks, that occurred in the 70s and through the 70s that, I just list them here. The fall of Bretton Woods, just think about that. Since 1944, so for a generation, currencies were fixed. Nobody had to understand anything about currencies. right? Because they were fixed. So you know what, they're going to be the same year in and year out, okay? So if you're doing trade or anything else, that's one thing that was not on your list. Suddenly you woke up in the early 1970s, and what had happened? They were all floating all over the place. Suddenly you had this big risk come in that permeates all of the economics as well as finance, and nobody had any real experience with it. You know, it's been a generation of not needing it. Now, I'm not going to go through each of these, but I can't resist it. We had the first oil crisis in '73, the creation of OPEC. Oil went from $2.40 a barrel to $13, okay? And we didn't know we had to number it, but by the end of that decade, we had another one. Pretty big shocks. If you lived through it, you'll know. What else was going on in the United States? Double-digit inflation. Inflation rates we had not seen since the 1920s, and before that, the Civil War in the 19th century, okay? There was nobody around who had dealt with double-digit inflation in the United States, okay? And what was accompanying it? Double-digit interest rates. And it didn't, you know, it varied, but it didn't go away until really the peak in 1981, where treasuries, U.S. treasuries, 21%. That's off the charts, okay? You can imagine that's a little disruptive. And then what else was going on? The stock market in the U.S. fell 50% in real terms in 18 months in 73 through 74. And what else happened? There was no money in the banks for residential housing. When I say no money, I mean literally no money. It wasn't a matter that people weren't good credits or there was economic, it just was no money. Now, a pretty good explanation, not saying the only one, was we had a regulation that said banks could only pay 5% maximum on deposits. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist, economist, or financier to figure out that if the government, full faith and credit with a tax break, is offering double-digit interest rates, and the bank is offering at most 5%, maybe a toaster, you're not going to get a lot of money. So it was essentially a shutdown of residential housing, period, no matter what kind of credit you were, okay? So that occurred. And then we had this double-digit inflation. Well, we had learned from macro what to do about that. There are tools to use, the central bank, fiscal policy, and so forth. But what else was going on? High unemployment. I list the numbers, remind you there. Double digits at the end. In fact, the peak was in, actually fairly late in '82, was 10.8% unemployment. Not for one quarter or 1 year, but throughout that whole period. So what do? We gave a name to this. High unemployment, high inflation. We called it stagflation because we didn't know what to do with it. And it was a disease that the macroeconomists, the monetary, didn't know what to do, because if they took action on one to try to solve it, they like throwing gasoline on the fire for the other. And let's hope it doesn't come back, okay? Because I'm not sure we know how to solve it today. But in any case, that's for another day to discuss. The point of all these pictures is to say a series of major shocks and things that we didn't even have experience with dealing with in the times all converged at once. Now, what was the response to that? The response was not slow down, pull in, get rid of innovation, slow down, the sort of thing we saw happening in 2008-9 crisis. It was an explosion of financial innovation, very specifically to address these risks and these new problems. And the innovation, was this. I have a list here. I'll run it quickly. I'm not going to explain it all. You know it anyway once you see it. But you may not have thought about when all these things came into place. You're used to seeing them. Of course they're here. They weren't always here. These weren't tomatoes that Mother Nature created at the creation. These were things that we created 50 years ago in response to this shock. And so what happened was that we had all of these things come into bear. The option exchange, the first one created, that's insurance. We had financial futures to deal with the currencies that we're now facing with risk, interest rates. Look, if you're making decisions as to whether to do a real estate development or to buy a house and get a mortgage, when you have double-digit interest rates and they could move 400 basis points in either direction, they're off the charts, okay? That's the difference of being solvent or not in your project, or as a house buyer thinking you know what you have budgeted and discovering you're in the wrong zip code. So you can understand why people were worried about the risks of interest rates, as we'll see how it was dealt with. We created the modern pension system for corporations in the United States, ERISA, and that's where corporate pension funds come. These trillion-dollar funds you see that you take, oh, they were always there. No, they weren't. They were created at that time as part of a solution. The first electronic exchange, passive investing in mutual funds, you all know indexing, they used to, sort of the application, if you like, of the story of the CAPM, right, Bill Sharp's contribution. And then international diversification by institutions. That's routine today. In fact, if you're in a DC-type pension plan, almost anywhere, standard advice everybody gets for the risk part of the portfolio is, yes, you should be exposed to stocks, but be sure to globally diversify. And you can. Okay? That wasn't the way things were. This was the first time that institutions, I'm not talking about direct investments, we're talking about the kind of thing we're talking about today. This just happened then, and that brought that in. There was more. I mentioned the mortgage crisis. We created a national mortgage market where the funding for residential mortgage could come from anywhere in the world, and it was not localized to banks where the real estate growth is going on, and you're trying to get those banks to finance it, and so forth. This created a very robust and secure source of funding, and never, at least to my knowledge, never since then, and that's a long time ago now, 4 decades, never since then has there not been mortgage money. Yes, it gets tighter and so forth, yes, but nothing like what we observed before that. It was just no money. There's always money. And so that's, I want to point that out. And then negotiated stock commissions. You say, well, how important is that? That's, in my view, the trigger, the catalyst that turned the stock market from being something that a bunch of individuals buying shares through brokers to being largely dominated by large institutions, either providing advice and services to individuals or doing it for things like pension funds. Because once you have negotiated commissions, the advantage of scale and size is going to push it the way that it's done in that direction. And finally, floating and other types of interest rates, all kinds of innovation. All of this came in response. But I would point out before I move on to say it was a response to the problem of the time. But unlike lots of response like monetary policy, this response continued to provide social dividends to the country up till today, for decades. So it's been paying. The national mortgage markets didn't just take care of a part of the problem then. It took care of it and still is taking care of it, whatever we see. The last thing I mentioned on the list, you see interest rate swaps, and that I just spend a little more time to point out. At that time, I already mentioned about interest rates being volatile and big and swinging. So you can understand why sensibly borrowers, whether institutional or for business or for housing, would like to have fixed rates. That's not hard to explain. On the other hand, where did the funding come from? Deposits. What do they want? Get their money whenever they want, which means it had to be floating. So every well-run bank trying to service its clients. So we're not talking about rogue banks, bad banks. We're talking about good banks doing what they're supposed to do, had an enormous risk in their intermediation. That's interest rate risk. Yeah, they have credit risk. That's one of the things they do. But they had interest rate risk that was enormous. Overnight, a simple contract, the interest rate swap, it's simple in design. You could do it on the back of a napkin, but incredibly complex to implement. And that's going to be another theme of what I'm saying this afternoon with you is, yes, good ideas are important, and they can drive things. But implementation is the big step, okay? And so here's this interest rate swap. I think knowing this sort of thing, you already know what they are. But basically what happened was, when you look at the profits of the bank, before the interest rate swap, they were very sensitive to interest rate moves because their revenues were fixed and their cost of money was floating. And every time rates went up, they became insolvent. Okay? Not much fun, especially when you're doing the right thing. All right? The interest rate swap, they just entered into it. They pay fixed, and they receive floating. Now look at the profit. Very insensitive to interest rates because the receiving of fixed is paid fixed. The payment of floating is paid back to you through the swap. And, of course, you pay a little less to the depositors than you earn on the floating side of the swap. And similarly, you charge a little more to the borrowers fixed than you pay on the swap. And that's your compensation for banking services. So I want to point out to you, it's counterintuitive as it may seem, being able to forecast interest rates or do great things with interest rates is not an essential tool to be a banker, a good banker. In fact, if you have that privilege of knowing how to forecast interest rates, you'd be crazy to try to capitalize that by the loan book. You'd go into an asset management business that pay 2 and 20, do it on an enormous scale, and use that information. So I want you to see that, again, in terms of engineering and science and understanding things, how things change and how we solve problems. Okay, so that's that. Now let me move on to, this was all in the 1970s and 80s. So that bringing together in that innovations that I described to you, if you look at every one of them, and since I know you've studied finance, you'll see that every one of them could not have been implemented or implemented well without the mathematical tools, the models, and the data that came from finance science. And I reminded you when I said at the beginning, what are the drivers of innovation? We had the coincidence of great science put together with data. We had technology, 360 systems and so forth, nothing like what we have today, but darn good compared to the past. So we had big breaks in technology, and now we had need. And that's my explanation for why it happened when it happened and not before, and why it's continued since. So we're understanding. So that's the 70s and 80s. Now I want to move you away from the United States to Europe and take you to a completely different thing to explain to you, show you another of the, what I think, very important contributions of finance, which is financial engineering. Solving problems for Main Street, okay? And the case I take first goes to Germany. At the reunification of Germany, which took place in the early 90s, it was decided as a national objective that Eastern Germany, or what was Eastern Germany, economically be brought up to the same level as West Germany. As I'm sure you're quite aware, there was a discrepancy. That was a national objective. Well, to do that, what would have to happen? The East would have to grow, and grow a lot, to catch up. Well, if you're going to grow, what do you need? Electricity. And in Germany, in that place where I'm talking about, the city of Leipzig, which was in East Germany, it's still here today, okay, the source for generating electricity was natural gas. So the city of Leipzig had to get more natural gas in order to meet the objectives. A very real, important problem for Main Street, okay? Well, now remember, who were the city managers at Leipzig? The same people who had been there when it was East Germany in a command and control economy, where net present value, where any of that stuff was never used. It was just, this is the way it is, prices stay where they are, and that's it. And that was for a generation. So I want you to keep in mind as I go through this solution and how it went, who they were presenting the solution to. Not to this audience, not to an audience you find in a pretty reasonably in most corporations today, but to an audience who had basically no knowledge of finance. So you had to design it to communicate it so they could understand what they were doing and make a decision. Keep that in mind as we go through the detail. Now, they were offered two physical choices. They were offered the choice to run a short pipeline from Leipzig to the west, up to the North Sea, and either get UK, Norwegian, Dutch gas, and so forth, which was priced at the time basically off US dollar. Heating oil was probably the proxy, but in any case. So that's what was one choice. The other choice is the consortium in Russia got in touch with them and said, we've got something for you. What we have for you is, first, build a pipeline from Leipzig to the Russian grid, a bit longer, as you can see from the map, okay? But in return, we will give you gas at a fixed price in Deutschmarks. This is pre-euro. So they said, the contract will say, for the next 15 years, X Deutschmarks per MCF. Your price of gas is fixed. Well, think about this. Again, use this common sense if you were these city managers. Remember who your constituency are and what they grew up in. You know what it would be like if they took the gas from the West. What happens to the spot price of gas, right? What else is going on? Gas is $1. Leipzig is Deutschmark. So it was both a currency problem of risk and gas itself, the physical cost. They thought about what would mean to their constituency if they suddenly saw their electricity bills doing this every month. And ask yourself, as you were the city manager, do you want to be going out to your constituency explaining that? So the Russian deal looked attractive. And indeed, the pipeline company, VNG, the CEO, said, maybe we ought to really consider this. So you understand these are the two choices they had and why. Now, because it's a much longer pipeline, the one to Russia is going to cost $300 million versus 50 for the smaller pipeline. Now, if you think these are small numbers, add zeros. Remember, this is Leipzig, 1990s, okay? So if you want to be interested, put as many zeros as you want on it, the story. All right? So what happened? A global bank, JP Morgan, I can now say, it's been enough time, all right? A AAA global bank, okay, had taken seriously financial engineering and, in fact, developed a whole part of its business as essentially the solutions business. A client has a problem. We don't come and say, we've got solutions. We sell hammers, and your problem is you want to knock in nails. What they said is, what do you want to do? And we'll figure out a solution. You understand the difference of a solution business than trying to convince money the solution you have is good for them. Very different. And they had such a vision, and it took people who were highly trained in solving unstructured problems, new problems, problems that maybe had never been addressed specifically before, and being confident that they could put together a workable, good solution that worked. So when they found out about this, what did they do? They got in touch with Leipzig, and they said, we have a third alternative. The choice one and choice two didn't look very good either way, but because one had one good feature, the Russian one, and the other one had a cost feature, the other, and so forth. And so, they didn't really like it. They said, we have a third choice. And here was the presentation. They said, look, build the pipeline to the west physically. Enter into a contract with us. And by the way, buy your gas from the west, dollar prices at whatever Deutschmarks are, whatever you pay, spot price. Anytime you pay more than X, X being the Russian number, okay, per MCF, we'll rebate to you the difference. Now just stop for a second. How hard a decision is that for you? Which would you rather have? Fixed price for 15 years, or the fixed price or the spot price, whichever is smaller? That's not a hard decision to make, correct? Well, that's what part of the beauty of the solution was. It was crystal clear to the ultimate user, decision makers, what was going on. They didn't have to do present value analysis or have a team of people go and do a whole bunch of stuff. So that's the core solution. But I want to take you a bit more through that, just to show you what good engineering, at least in my perspective, a good engineering is. It's not just simply cost. So here's a comparison sheet. I'm sorry for those who are looking at the side screens. I think my pointer only works here, but you can figure it out. let's just go through a comparison of the Russian solution with the JPM financially engineered solution, okay? Because JPM was doing nothing physical. They just wrote contracts to Leipzig. So it's just purely intangible. Well, the cost of the capital cost is 300. What was the cost to do the JPM solution? Well, it was 50 million for the physical pipeline, but what else? JP Morgan had to be paid for providing this insurance, this guarantee, okay? This isn't profit, but this is getting paid. And the deal they said was, they said, we'll do this for $125 million fee, which was to cover everything, okay? And they pointed out, you know, you're saving $250 million in capital charges. You're paying half of it to us, but you're getting the other half to you. So that's not bad, okay? So that was it. So the all-in cost for the JP Morgan one saved Leipzig $125 billion. Again, put whatever number of zeros you need to get your attention because of the passage of time. This was serious money to that city, okay? What else? Operating costs. Well, the Russians, the Deutschmarks per MCF, the JPM, the minimum of either the fixed X price, say or the spot price, which gives you a saving, which is max 0 X minus S. Anybody recognize what that formula is? Yeah, that's a put, right? It's a put on the spot price of gas in Deutschmarks, all right? So that's worth something. I'm sure you're aware. I don't have to explain that to this audience. So that's what you save there. But I want to talk about risks that are not so easily quantified because that's part of the real world solution of a good one. The first one I'm going to tell you about is local political risk. If they do the Russian deal, and let's say they get the X Deutschmarks per MCF, sounds good when they sign the contract. Suppose 3 years later, spot prices for gas in Deutschmarks is X over 2, half. What's going to happen? Leipzig is going to be paying X, and the rest of the world, as seen by people in the market, are paying X over 2, half the price. Do you think the constituency in Leipzig would notice that and might say to the government, why are we paying twice as much? Now, we all understand hedging. They did the right thing to get rid of risk, or they were trying to. But hedging, sometimes you wish you didn't do it after the fact. If you knew it was going to happen, then it's easy, but you didn't. But one of the most difficult things, I find it hard to do even in class, is to explain the hedging and, you know, the risks and so forth of that. That it's not an easy task. Doing it in a soundbite to people who hadn't dealt with the finance at all is not something you can do with the public. And by the way, anybody who's from the United States recognizes this has kind of happened to the state of California with electricity, but that's another story. Let's not go to that. It's not fun to try to explain to a constituency why the government is paying twice the price that it could be bought for by anybody else. Look at what happens with the JPM solution. It never happens. Why? Because you never pay more than X. You may pay less, but you never pay more than the spot price. So this doesn't become a story. It isn't that everybody else is getting it at X over 2 and you're paying X. So it solved that political problem. And that's important, both for the decision, but also for a solution for the contract. The second one is performance risk. Yes, Russia is guaranteeing 15 years of gas in Deutschmarks at a fixed price. At that time even, Russia did not have a good reputation for always fulfill obligations that it signed on to. And I remind those who know about it, 6 years later, they issued Russian bonds in the United States and elsewhere, but in the United States, through Goldman Sachs, in rubles, not dollar bonds, ruble bonds, local bonds, and they defaulted on the first interest rate payment. They never made one interest rate payment. And you know, they could print the money, for heaven's sakes. I don't think that they had any trouble getting it through wherever they needed to do that. And yet they didn't pay it. So contract risk here, what's worse than being uninsured? It's thinking you're insured when you're not. Because you get there, you need the insurance, and they say, we're not going to pay it. Now you're in the worst of all worlds. At least if you know you're uninsured, you might take some preventative action or do something. So that's a big risk. What about JP Morgan? AAA, a real AAA bank, global bank, watched by the Fed, the Bank of England, every freaking central bank in the world was on top of it. Capital, traded on exchange, we could see the prices, all right? That's a pretty low contract risk, okay? JP Morgan is not likely to default on that. So again, the engineered solution got rid of contract performance risk. But we're not done. What else is a risk? If Leipzig builds that pipeline to the Russian grid, where it's getting its gas? From Russia. What happens if geopolitical situations occur? Not economic ones directly, not because they can't, but the geopolitical conditions occur where they shut the gas off. You're under vulnerability, the city of Leipzig, to those geopolitical risks, which, as we see sadly, it is not a hypothetical. That's a modern day issue, well known. And finally, I would mention the following, which is very 2024. Pipelines are dirty. No one argues about that. We build them when we make a decision that the benefit to society of building them makes the dirtiness of what we create worthwhile. Now, we don't have to debate of whether that should be. That's another topic. But that's what we do. But we know they're dirty. What happened here? The pipeline to Russia is a big, long, dirty thing running all the way across the system. The pipeline to the west is a much shorter one. It's therefore a green solution. It reduced the amount of pollution and dirtiness put into the system by choosing to be able to do the shorter pipeline result. And so that is a greener solution. So this is 1990. So, and this is not an isolated case. I have many of them, but we're not going to spend the rest of the day on that. But what I wanted you to see and why I wanted to take you through this is to make the point that finance is solving very real-world economic problems. Leipzig, for the country of Germany, in their objectives of what they wanted to achieve, important to all those people. And that a well-engineered solution goes beyond just cost saving or one-dimensional thing, but takes account of all the elements. And I thought this one, as a real-world one, was done. Now, the last thing I would mention is, it was a very simple contract for Leipzig people to understand. That's good. It was easy to decision. There was no fine print or doing all of that. But it was very complicated for JP Morgan to do this because there were no natural gas markets or swaps to do things. The best you could do was use heating oil. You didn't have very long maturities. You had all kinds of things. Since it's a cap on something, of course, volatility matters. All the stuff that you know about, all those risks were there. Their ability to lay those risks off, which of course makes it, whether it's feasible to do and affects the cost, was limited. But they used their ingenuity, training, and knowledge and experience that they felt that they could do dynamic trading and lots of other things that they knew about how to do, very complicated, taking lots of skills. They could do that to lay off enough risk to give a good price and be comfortable and convince their risk committee that this was an okay thing to do there. And they did. Today, it would be a much easier problem to solve because of the growth of markets and solutions and the ability to transact more. So that's why I thought we could take you through the 90s. Now, moving ahead, we're going to get to today. Don't worry, okay? We still have time. All right, moving ahead through the 1990s, really up to the beginning of the 21st century to today, what I wanted to point out to you is that one of the things that has happened, and this is long before we had fintech, but we've always had fintech. We've always used technology. We use technology in what I've already described to you. But what has been going on here is, among other things, the cost of trading, for example, has dramatically fallen. I have charts here you can see for the U.S. bid-ask spreads in the stock market, developed ex-U.S., but also emerging markets. You can see from the picture, in the U.S., the trading costs of the spreads have collapsed by, I don't know, 90%. You can see the picture. The point of the matter is, and even in emerging markets, enormous decline. And you can see the knock-on effects. First, of course, it's nice to have lower costs. But secondly, with lower trading costs, that allows you to do solutions like the one J.P. Morgan did and to create more customized solutions as the price and cost of doing it is down. So let me now, oh, and the next thing I wanted to show you was mutual funds. It opened the world up to you and I, ordinary people, to be able to have well-diversified portfolios, you know, things that are going to give us much higher reward for risk at low cost here. And we could see the cost of the funds all came down substantially as well. So all of these affect Main Street, you and I, people around the world. And of course, all of this technology has moved throughout the world. You'll find these markets and other things, not just here. And so that's where we are up to today. Now, here's the chart I want to show you. Because in all the excitement about fintech and everything going on, the excitement makes it sound like we've never seen this before. This is going to transform the world. And it may. But this isn't the first time. In fact, what I want to show you with this chart, this little time chart, it starts 8 centuries ago. The data doesn't, I don't know where, this is not my data, but I used it, and it's very good. This traces major innovations, not all of them securities, things like double entry booking, major innovations through time. And what do you see? You see big financial innovation, and you know what that means. Impact on the financial system and impact on society. Keep that in mind. So all of this is about society in the end. That's the end game. All right? It has been going on for centuries. But what this picture shows you is what? Not only are we continuing to have financial innovation progress, it's accelerating. What took 25 years in one period took 5 years later. And then today, innovations that might take 5 years then might be 2. That's what this picture is showing. In fact, you have to have a microscope on the scaling to see all the innovation that's taking place now. So innovation has been going on for centuries, real serious one, but it's accelerating. So what is this telling us? Well, the message I would give to you that is twofold. If you're designing new solutions, particularly something big like a retirement system, you know, something that you don't want to do too often, you want to build it right. The typical practice, I believe, is you look around at what is best practice, and you collect all of that, put it on a table, and you go through it and say, well, this piece of best practice and this one, we'll put them together, and that's how we'll build our new retirement system. My message to you from this picture is that's not good enough. If it's best practice, it exists. If it exists, it's a legacy. And my metaphor for that, forgive me, but I find that this sometimes communities, I'm driving down the highway, okay? But I'm driving a little fast. Don't tell anybody that, okay? So I'm looking in my rearview mirror to see if anybody is going to interfere with my progress. And suddenly I realize I'm traveling 30 meters a second looking in the rearview mirror. Now, when does that work? When what's behind me and what's in front of me stays the same. That works, right? Does that look like staying the same in financial? No. So my quick statement to you is, yes, of course, look at best practice, but that's not good enough for the best solution. Don't ask the question, has it been done? Ask, can it be done? And if it can be done, like the solution of Leipzig in the micro, which never specifically had been done before, but they knew they could do it. Just so that's how we should proceed that. And the training and knowledge you have from your backgrounds allow you to have that skill to look at what can be done, even if it hasn't been done. So let me now move to the present with the, I've got about how many minutes left? Where's my, no, I could see the clock, but we started a little late. Okay, I think I can wrap this up, particularly in this audience, very quickly. But I wanted to make it. In looking at today, I wanted to talk about an innovation of today, and it's an innovation which is involved, it's called, it was developed in theory and then found its way into practice. We call it a retirement security bond, RSB, and basically it's a design, an innovation to help retiring funding challenge, which we know is a global problem. I don't have to, it's every day today. China just announced how much trouble what it has to do in today's papers. Okay, and the idea is to help address that, including serving the informal labor sector. By that I mean, for this purpose, they don't have a pension. They aren't in any pension plan, maybe not even in the equivalent of Social Security. They're off the grid. But they still need to solve retirement. And if you're building a retirement system for your country, it has to be for all the people in your country, not just some, to be a good retirement system. So this is addressing that, among other things. And it has the feature that it wasn't designed to do that together. We were focused on trying to solve the problem at hand. It happens to be something that also will help facilitate infrastructure development and may reduce government bonds, debt, and risk. And furthermore, it's designed to work anywhere in the world that has a government bond market. So it's not an Anglo-Saxon design or US design, it's a global design. Now, if you say, gee, RSB, I kind of heard that somewhere. Well, there's good reason. Here in Brazil, last year, January 2023, so a year and 4 months ago, you introduced a version of this bond called Rende-Meiz. Okay, the Treasury did. So first, congratulations to be the first country to do so. You've shown that Brazil is an innovator. But let me go on. So you may know already a lot about what this is. But I'm going to take you through it at least briefly for two purposes. One, to show you the detail to make good design, when you actually want to do it, not something you scratch on the back of a napkin somewhere and say, here's an idea. But when you really have to implement something like this, it takes a lot of careful detail if you want to succeed. Okay? And so that's one. The second reason is that you introduce a simplified version of this design, okay? And of course, it should be tailored to each country. But my hope and belief is that if it succeeds, that was version 1.0. And if it works, you can move to version 2.0 and improve it. And then 3.0, improve it more. So you might look at this as a rough picture of what directions you might want to consider to add to what you've already done in your innovation. So that's the objective. So now let me get to what it is. Just to remind you, what is an RSB? RSB is a government bond, full faith and credit, period. So every question you might have about it, what happens if I own this and I pass away? The answer is, what happens if you own a full faith and credit government bond? It's the same answer. So that'll take care of a lot of detailed questions of that sort. Okay? Well, what's different about it is two things. The pattern of payments doesn't look anything like a government bond, at least any I've seen governments issue. Okay? And secondly, what the payments are indexed to. Okay? And so that's those are the two key pieces. The third piece is the following. They have the feature, the payment feature, that you buy the bond now, you get paid nothing, no coupons, nothing, for a certain number of years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And then, when it starts paying, the payments are level payments for, let's say, 20 years, 25 years. You obviously can set those numbers, right? So everybody understand? Buy it today, get nothing until some future date, and then a stream of level payments, no balloon payment, done. Okay? What does that look like if you step and look at it with the right lens? That's what you do when you put your money in a pension. You contribute to the pension, or your employer does it for you, right? Do you get anything from it? No. Until when? Until you retire. And then when you do, if you get a pension, what do you get? A level payment. The idea here is to create a bond, something that individually someone could buy, that's a bond, that has the features in terms of functionality as if you were putting your money in a pension. People seem to like pensions. And so that's the thing that we were trying to achieve with this. So that's the rationale. Bond traders say to me, oh, I wouldn't buy that. That's not something we trade. I don't even know what to do. And I would say, well, I'm not trying to sell it to you. I'm trying to sell it to real people to solve their problem. And they're going to like it because they like pensions. Anyway, so we got that going there. So what does this look like on the shelf? And you can see it in a version of it at Treasury. You have a bunch of bonds on the shelf. They don't have maturity dates on them. They have dates on them. But the dates are the dates when they start paying. So let's say a 2033 would be a bond that you buy now, and it doesn't pay anything until 2033, and then it starts its payment 9 years from now. 2058 would be same idea, different date. So on the shelf, if you like to think, are all these different bonds with different dates. When you come in, figuratively, you do it electronically to buy it, what's the first thing you look at for? What's the first thing you look for when you go to a shoe store to buy shoes, or even online? You go to the size 12 if you're a 12, or you go to the size 6 if you're 6. You don't bother looking at any other sizes because it's irrelevant. The idea here is what you do is you look at the date when you think you're going to retire, and that's the bond you buy. So if you're going to retire in 2058, you buy 2058 bonds. And you know, as long as that's when you're going to retire, if you buy a 2058 bond today, and then you buy another one in a month or a year or 2 years or 5 years from now, you're always buying the same bond. It's a 2058. It's not by maturities. It's by the bond itself. What does that mean? It means when you have your accumulation, what do you have? You have a portfolio, not of bonds. You have a single thing bond, all the same, at just different scale. Pretty easy to understand. You see, that's the feature of why it's designed this way. Okay. Now, with knowing what it is, some people will say to me, look, Professor, those are good ideas maybe, but, you know, I'll use US, forgive me, but it's easier for me. Sorry. They say, we can buy 30-year tips, Treasury inflation, but they're good enough. You know, it's not perfect, it's imperfect, and there's stuff floating around, the payments don't match up and so forth, but good enough. How many times have you heard that from somebody in innovation? Yeah, good idea, but not worth the trouble. It's good enough. Well, let's actually confront the data with that. Let's confront the facts. Don't just accept it because someone tells you. Let's look at the picture. Let's say I go in and I buy a bond today. Let's say I'm going to retire in 2058. So I buy a 2058 bond. What's the payment pattern? Money goes out. I pay nothing. 2058, I start getting a stream of payments. Everybody agree? That's what I told you, right? How many transactions, if I retire, or this person retires when they plan, how many transactions are involved with respect to this bond? One, to buy it. Why? Because you don't have to do anything until you get to 2058. And if you get there and you retire, the payments you're going to get are the payments you want to get, so there's no reason to change it. One payment. Now let's look if you do what my competitors say to me, it's good enough. We buy 30-year tips. Let's look at the payment. The money goes out. What do? Every 6 months, there's a coupon payment. Forget about fees. Just you have to do something with it. The money comes in, and you've got to do something. You've got to make a decision. You've got to go and do something. You understand? Don't even think about transaction costs of fees. Just think about it as your time and energy and thought. And if you have a small investment, which you might have in absolute terms, when you, especially in the younger part of your accumulation life, it's like a small number, you know, a couple of hundred reals, something like that, maybe much less, who knows. And you're not going to do it, are you? You're just going to, it's too much trouble. You've just destroyed it. You go along, how many of those little payments do you get? 60, 30 years, every half year. 60 payments. And then what happens? When you get to the end of 30 years, you get a big balloon payment, and you got to do something about that. What rate are you going to, what price are you going to be able to buy the 2058 at that point, or the equivalent? You have no idea, neither does anybody else. That's 30 years from now. You're taking enormous reinvestment risk with a big part of the cash you have, all right? And you're still far from even getting to retirement. So, as a practical matter, one transaction, nothing you have to do if things work out. And if they don't work out, you make some small adjustments. It's not because you're probably going to retire around that time, okay? Versus 61. End of story. You see why it makes a big difference in terms of the practical application, people actually using it. Okay, so, you know, I'm not going to take you through this example here. It just shows you, though, one thing I wanted you to see is decision making. Remember, they're buying this for their, you think of it, they're buying it for themselves, which means they have to make decisions to buy it, and then what do, right? So this is nobody with an advisor. This is nobody in a pension fund. This is someone doing it for themselves. How hard is it to figure out, first of all, the decisions that have to be made? What's the decision? One decision is, which bond do I buy? Well, when are you planning to retire? By the way, if you don't know, the default is Social Security, whatever the standard retirement age. So every person has the answer to that question even before they start. So they know what year they're planning to retire. So that's the first piece of it. What's the second thing? To meet my goal of a good retirement, how much do I need? All right? Well, how much I need is enough, I've used as my criteria, enough to sustain the standard of living I enjoyed in the latter part of my work life before I retired for the rest of my life. That's a good retirement. We may not get to that goal, but I think you'd all agree that's a pretty good generic. That's a good retirement. Okay? Now, what else does this say? I didn't mention it, but this bond doesn't pay in euros or dollars. It doesn't pay in inflation protection. It pays in aggregate per capita consumption. That's the index we use. Okay? Now, why did we pick that? Because the goal is the standard of living when you retire. Therefore, it's the standard of living that I have when I retire, not the standard of living when I bought the bond 30 years earlier. Inflation protection only locks in the standard of living now. It doesn't handle the fact that you may not find that standard of living that attractive 30 years later, okay? But if you do aggregate per capita consumption, that covers both inflation and the right inflation, consumption, not producer price index or GDP or something like that. And it covers standard of living improvement in consumption. Standard of living, not GDP growth, which could be investments, and you know that from your training. By putting it there, you've simplified the decision as to how many bonds they need. I have 50,000 is the goal. Well, where did I get the 50,000? I'm using U.S. money. That's the standard of living they're living at today. That's what they live on today. That's where they get that number. And they know that. Everybody knows that. Adults, they may have a 6th grade education formally, but if they can take care of themselves, they know how they're living today and they're spending their money. So this is something they know. And therefore, the answer to them is, your goal is whatever you're living on now, unless you choose to change it. You can always make it anything you want, but the key is you don't have to do an analysis if you want. We give you you have the answer to that question. Then how many bonds are your goal? Well, if each bond we're paying $10 a year, just to make the math simple for me, how many bonds do they need? 10 divided into 50,000 is what? 5,000. So their goal is 5,000 bonds. See how easy it was to get to it? You see how it didn't use any information from an advisor? They didn't have to go on the internet. They didn't have to take a course in finance. They already knew the answer. And that's a key to design in general, not just for retirement, for the future anyway. Not always done in the present for sure. All right? So then they know that. But what happens, let's say, 25 years from now or 20 years from now, they ask themselves, how am I doing? You know, it's like if those of you, if you have an account like a 401k or something, you look and say, how much money I have in there. That doesn't tell you very much about how you're doing to retirement, but we won't go into that now. But I'm pointing that out to you. So what does that tell us? What it tells us is, let's say they have 3,000 bonds. They know instantly what they have. They have 30,000 a year when they retire. protected for everything. So they can understand it in current terms, but know they're protected for future terms. Get the point? Now they can think about it. You know, one person might say, you know, I'm taking care of my kids now. I'm not going to take care of them financially when I'm retired, okay? And I love bird watching. That's my passion. It's not expensive. I already have the binoculars. So maybe I don't need 50 when I do. Maybe I need less. I don't know. Someone else will look at that and say, no way I could live on that. You see how you could do intelligent decision making without being trained in finance, without having to do anything, because you've been framed in a framework and the design is such that it takes away all these things. There's no forecasting of inflation. There's no forecasting of standard of living. There's no of these put your finger in the air and hope you can forecast something 40 years away. That is what we want in design, we think. And we think that's the direction that RSB should take. And what I want to say to you is, you know, I hope that's the direction. First, I hope that Rende Mays is an enormous success. We'll see. I think it's wonderful that it was introduced and done the way it has. But I hope that you'll not, you know, stop here and you'll keep improving it. And I hope that this is giving you both a guide to directions to move, that you might want to move, and secondly, why those directions are there. It's not just because I made it up. I've explained to you how it makes it work for real people. Last, I'll close on this, is to point out who are the users. When Rende Mays was issued, it was issued to only be sold to individuals here in Brazil. Okay? No institutions, no one else. And it was really with those people in mind. This allows people who are, in the US we call the gig economy, who don't really, they're off the grid as far as being in any system. And they're covered by these because they now have a very good tool that they can save for their own on saving. But it also has those who have pension plans, and this is everywhere in the world, okay, where they have a pension plan, but the amount the plan pays is not going to be enough. And they need to add to it, so they may have to do personal saving. Now, they may do personal saving through some kind of formal DC type Pillar 2 plan, in which case they'd probably be held by the funds or something on behalf of people. Or they could do it on personal saving directly. That just depends on choice and what is available to you. Okay? But there certainly be those people. So people who want to accumulate more than they're getting from their pension, for those who are in a DC type plan, but now you know if you're in a defined benefit plan, you have to make choices and you take the risk of those choices, right? That's the difference with a pension, okay? But you have to make choices. This is a nice choice to have in there. It doesn't say everybody will pick it for everything, but rather it's there for them, and you can see it will serve those people too. Who else? Well, if you look at people, advisors, people who are, in fact, even quite well off, okay, their advisors like to build things for them, solve their problems, take care of a cousin or something for the next life and so forth. And these are perfect tools to be used by them to put together more sophisticated packages for them, so they'll use them. And finally, and most importantly in my view, institutions, pension funds, insurance companies writing annuities, those who are taking on the liabilities are promising to pay you something in retirement, okay, a promised payment in retirement. This is the ideal hedge asset. They're going to love this. I wouldn't pay very big sales commission to anybody selling this to them because they're going to love them. And you know, it's not a hard sale. So you see the number of users is pretty diverse. And I won't go through everything on government, but government wasn't just an automatic, you know, knee-jerk reaction. It should be done by government. There was a specific reason. Number one, in every country that I ever do anything to try to advise for, I always take as the best credit to be full faith and credit of the government. I don't think you can offer more than that because governments have too much power to promise them more, unless you're somebody who's extremely wealthy and can, you know, move money around the world and have an airplane to get out of town or something like that, which is irrelevant. Okay? So what else does it do? It avoids huge disclosures. Imagine people being promised payments 20, 30 years from now. If that were a private sector offering where there's credit risk, what would the disclosure be like here in Brazil? How much would you have to say to people? Yes, this is what they're promising, but they may not, and let us could you imagine that disclosure to everybody? No, it doesn't work. the beauty of having a full faith and credit, which means basically as low risk as you can get. I won't swear that it means 100% sure. That's not the point. But what's the best you can do, okay? You don't have to disclose on record. It's simple. They just look at the payment and they say, I understand it. I don't have to have days of explaining it. And the same thing when you look at, deploying it. And that's what you did here with Rendemage. By deploying it as a government bond in sector, you had everything put together. You had the auction market, you had the pricing market, you had everything was done. You didn't have to create a new agency. You just created a new bond. That's, when it comes to innovation, getting it done, the more is stuff that's already familiar, the better. And the less things you have to build to do it, okay? And then finally, I would just point out there's some benefits beyond that to the government, namely, if you're doing infrastructure financing, particularly countries that don't have the ability to issue very long maturities, as we know, not their problem necessarily, but it's just reality. And we know infrastructures are all about paying money out for many years and then getting the benefits later. But what happens if you fund those with 5, 10-year bonds, depending on airports or whatever you're building, okay? You have to borrow more than you need because you have to borrow money to give them back as the interest payments because you've got no money coming in. And you're probably going to have to roll that debt before the project's done. And what happens, it's like that investment risk that I showed you before. What happens if you get down 5 years down the road, the airport is half built, and you have to refund and you can't, or you can only do it at exorbitant prices. You're left with half an airport, and we've seen that happen in some countries. It's not a hypothetical. This gives you a much more matched, because you have money in, you don't pay anything out, and then you pay it out later when you're getting it. It's a much better maturity match, risk match, something else. So that will make the funding of infrastructure more secure and more risk-free. I also mentioned the VAT, if you have VAT. You say, well, we're paying consumption. But what if consumption grows a lot? Well, first of all, that's good for your economy, unless it's just inflation. But if it's standard of living, that's actually good. So those are good times anyway. But beyond that, the government with the VAT has an asset which is match funded to this. VAT is a consumption tax. It's not perfect, but it's close. So when revenues go up and down with consumption, what you have to pay up goes out. You all understand hedging. You see, that's actually more secure for the government than issuing nominal bonds or issuing just inflation bonds, because you don't have perfect hedge to that. So I'm just saying those are some of the features why we picked it. And it may be also that when the outside world looks at you in terms of this, and I run way over, so I apologize to you to stop here. And I'll just say to you, I hope you can do this. I'm excited about it. I want to show you that I did have a slide showing, giving full credit to you. And it's wonderful to be here talking to you in a place where it's doing, and talking to people who can make this happen. I hope this is giving you some encouragement, not just for this particular project, but for the role of financial innovation, finance, in terms of having impact on society around the world. Stabilization, security. And that's my message. You're in a darn important industry. You're doing an important job. And what's beautiful about it, in addition, is it's global. So if it gets boring where you are, nothing's going on to solve, pack your bags. There's a place in the world where you can take your tools, just like here. This will work in any country. This isn't designed just for one country or one region, okay? You can take your tools that you've learned and developed, and you can apply them anywhere in the world. So I envy you to the extent that this is for all of you to do. I wish I had even longer time to keep doing it, but I can assure you I'm doing it because I love what this is and because I think it's really fun to do something that you enjoy and that you feel that it makes a difference to society. Thank you.
much. So I'd like to welcome our panelists. So we're just going to reorganize the floor here.
Can you put me so that I can see all three? Yeah, just put it so I can see the three. Yeah, maybe I could see. I just like to see all three.
So the microphones are here. They're working.
Yeah, they're working. I guess I can pass around. So thank you,
The discussion
Professor.
will be led by Vinicius Carlos.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
you're
Professor. It's been
welcome.
great. So it's a huge honor. I guess we all had a great lesson on how, good theory, good science can have major practical impact. And I really like this approach of economists as engineers designing instruments, tools, and markets. So it's a pleasure to chair this session. So I guess we can start with Arthur. So we go alphabetical here. Arthur, Rogério, and then Vinicius. So thank you so much, Professor, again.
Thank you, Professor. It's a great honor to be here. I guess the first question I'll have is that when you look at the history of innovation, right, and there was a stumbling block in 2008, right, where we created a lot of complex instruments that were not fully understood by regulators and things like that. How would you see the science evolving from now on, right? I mean, and the necessity of having a complete understanding of what the risks in the systems are involved?
That's a very good question. Look, in 2008-9 crisis, at least a part of it, some attributed all of it, but what caused the crisis, in fact, is multifaceted and very complicated, and we should stay away from there. But part of what was legitimately a challenge was that there were a bunch of instruments that were issued, derivative instruments, structured products, that were very complicated. Most of them surrounded mortgages, but not that exclusively. And when you looked at them, it was a little hard to understand why you needed such complexity. Complexity is okay, not for the user, but for the provider, if it's needed. But it wasn't there. And there's no question that it contributed, certainly, if nothing else, catalytically, to the crisis. We have to do better, that's for sure. But I first want to say, put it in context. Because the reaction at the time, people said, get rid of financial innovation. I just spent, and you were a kind audience to spend it with me, staying over time, I appreciate it. But I just spent a good bit of your time, as well as mine, trying to show you all the power of financial innovation. So let's put it in context. You don't shut the whole thing off or cut it down and say it's a bad idea because you have some bad actors, or either fools or knaves. Fools are people who don't know what they're doing. They don't mean to do harm. And knaves know darn what they're doing. But whichever they are, they have a big effect on it. And so we absolutely have to deal with that. There are a number of directions in which that has to be done, which I'm going to shorten up so we can move on in the questions. But just to say, in one area in particular, we have to do better with regulation and oversight, but we can't put all the burden on that. We have to have well-trained people in the firms who use these tools. These tools are very powerful. That's why we use them. You saw how we could change things around. But something is a very powerful tool for changing things around, if misused for whatever reason, can do damage. And we therefore have to have people who know what they're doing so that they at least are not the fools, and we need to be prepared to protect against the knaves.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. It's a pleasure to be here and discuss this with you. My question is, do you feel that, what's your opinion on digital assets, Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, blockchain technology? Do you think these are real innovations that add value to society or might add value to society at some point? Or are they just smokescreen for asset price bubbles and speculation and so on?
That's a very good question, and I'll answer it in two parts. The first part is that we have to, it's no question that if we're distinguishing the tools versus the application of the tools, and I would distinguish blockchain as a tool to blockchain applied, let's say, in cryptocurrencies. That's an application. So first idea is to separate those two. There's no question in my mind that the tools, and this will include AI as well, that the tools are going to be very useful for some applications to improve society. No question about it. They belong there. Okay? That said, one has to be selective on how you evaluate the applications. And the way I would do with any innovation, but particularly here, is first ask, what problem or problems is this innovation, this application now, not the blockchain, but the application, what problem is it solving? You should be able to answer that. If you can't answer that, that's a sign that maybe it's not something you need to be doing or it's not important to do, okay? Then once you've answered that, then tell me how that is being dealt with today. Whatever that application is supposed to do, whether it's liquidity or whatever it is, tell me how that application, what that application is supposed to solve is how it's done today, so I know how it's done today. Two, show me why it is that this new application, this new innovation, is better than the one we're doing today. Okay? That's number three. But there's a fourth one. Is there something better than the one you have in mind to solve it? So even if the one you have in mind is better than what we're doing today, remember I put up the sign to you, don't settle just for, better. If you can, go to head for best. So if there's an even better way to do it, okay? Now I'll illustrate to you, because you've asked this question, I feel it's right on the nose, okay? So let's take something a little, I think everybody here has heard of cryptocurrencies, right? If you read the papers, lose or anything, okay? Most of the discussion of cryptocurrencies are around cryptocurrencies that are not legal tender and, frankly, I'm a theorist, so I almost always can come up with a theory how something might work. In all candor, I've been puzzled. I don't know how it could ever be a currency, okay? For one thing, it's not what is it connected to? If you're going to have a currency, what does a currency do? It allows you to buy things you want. A house, a car, a tomato, television set, something, right? There's no linkage between that currency and those things. And there's no natural way that they will become that way. It isn't like it's all naturally come together. Now, in contrast, if you talk about a cryptocurrency, I mean, the idea of having cryptocurrency, the electronic currencies and so forth, and speed up payments and reduce cost, a great idea, no question about it. So that's, but I tend to think, and I understand that there are issues there as well. So I don't mean to say this is I think a central bank cryptocurrency deals with that in a couple of ways. First of all, cryptocurrencies are completely opaque. You have no idea who's what or anything. Nobody does. I don't, certainly. Okay? So when it's opaque, you need trust. And generally, the best trust you can find, doesn't mean it's always valid, is your government, unless it's in turmoil. That's usually the standard. Okay? Number two is, what does every central bank have as typically its number one responsibility? To keep the currency close to what the price of things that people buy, meaning don't let too much inflation, don't let deflation. have it be very much as possible that bill that you have in your pocket or in your electronic wallet, that what it buys today, it'll be able to buy in 5 years. In other words, price stability. Every central bank does that. They've been doing that, and they do that. Now, they don't do it perfectly. No one does. But they do it. So by a cryptocurrency that's government, you have two things. You have trust, and you have that they already know how to stabilize price. Stable coins are a kind of an idea, and in theory, it sounds great. The experience, at least mine that I've seen, is doing this sort of thing doesn't work very well. If you want something from 2008, so we realize we're not just talking about today, money market funds, as you all know, $1, they're fixed price. They stay, and they supposedly are trying to keep to it. We ended up having to, in the United States, guarantee all these money market funds so they didn't create a disaster or break the buck, okay? So I would point out to you, maybe a stable coin someday might do what I'm talking about. I haven't seen evidence of it. So my view is, you talk about cryptocurrencies, I think they're a great idea if they're done the right way, and I've suggested what my view is the direction for that. If you talk about them for the wrong way, and that includes store of value. How can you have a store of value that, you know, that you don't know what it can buy? And I have to mention one quickly. Imagine if you know, some countries are calling, I'm not picking on Bitcoin, but we all know Bitcoin is a name, but don't think of it personally. Some countries have made Bitcoin an official currency. It's not. Could you imagine if you wrote your employment contracts in Bitcoins in January of this year, and now you're paying people the same number of Bitcoins in the contract at the prices that they are now? Or had the story been different from January to now, Bitcoin is going this way, what your employees would be thinking and what you're paying them? It just doesn't make sense. And that's my, we have to be selective. No question that they can be used, the technology and the ideas, but we have to be very selective and not just go with, hey, this works.
Thank you. I have a second question. Maybe we should go around
Yeah, I
and
guess we can go around because I'll compound on your question. So the technology behind, you know, crypto coins and so on. Do you think that this technology is useful somehow? What's your view on DeFi, decentralized finance, and whether you foresee a future in which intermediaries won't be needed anymore? So technology can replace the intermediation as we know, or informational problems are still pervasive and we need some sort of intermediation?
That's a very good question. At least in my half century or more of being involved, that is a short time in terms of history, we've always talked about getting rid of intermediation. We've all thought we could go back to the neoclassical model of individuals and markets, and that solved everything. But to come directly to your question, let's say you know, the decentralized finance. All right, what is that? That's, let's say, between two parties, their own contracts and everything like that. That's fine. That's a good idea for some purposes. For one thing, it will mitigate some risks, because if they're all individual and all done, there's not the problem of everything being in one place and then it all has interaction and creates a systemic event. It's less likely. So that's in its favor. What's missing, however, is you have to be selective. In some applications, going to decentralize is a great idea. In other cases, it's a disaster. You want to centralize. Again, going back to 2-8 for a practical example, okay? The swap market and these other contracts are all bilateral contracts. They are definitely DeFi, right? They're between two. Maybe they weren't done electronically with a smart contract, but they were done, right? That's the ultimate in DeFi, just two people in contract. What happens when one party wanted to get out of the swap because its conditions changed? The other party is not going to want to come out. You'd have to negotiate. So how did they solve it? They went to another party, made another bilateral contract with the opposite trade to offset the risk. So now you have two contracts with three entities. Well, as contract life got longer, these things stay out there forever because it never pays to get rid of them, okay? And so you had an explosion of bilateral decentralized contracts, each one of them beautifully decentralized, but as a group, you've created an absolute nightmare. Because if this one fails, now the ones that there, all those contracts were hedged as long as there's no defaults. As soon as there's default, aka Lehman Brothers, a very big default with hundreds of trillions and just a disaster. As soon as that happens, the world comes completely apart because they are linked. They're not decentralized because they've done these contracts with different people. They aren't all often isolated walls, which is a hypothetical you think of when you talk about these things. So I'll stop on that, but say very clearly, so it's clear. I think the technology is a useful one, the right tool for the job. A hammer and a saw are both good tools. And you use a hammer to knock nails in, and you use a saw to take the leg off this chair, or a wood chair, okay? And the other isn't very good. So that's my rule. I don't this is not a sham, but you have to do it right.
I guess.
Well, I'd like to go back to the timeline and extend it into the past and to the future. What would you say is the most important innovation after the BSM model? And there's a bunch of bright students here, right? So they would be studying, the new finance. What excites you more, and what would you advise them to look at?
Well, that's it's a big world. And by the way, problem finding is a good part of research as well as problem solving. So I think you can come up with better problems than maybe I can. But let me just give you a little bit along the line that you say. One of the reasons Black-Scholes-Merton was important, or has been important, was far beyond the option pricing or derivative pricing. It was the replicating process, the ability to do financial engineering. The very thing that J.P. Morgan was doing was created with this. This was just right for it. And so that's an important driver. And since that work was done, there's been big improvements to it for that purpose, namely things like stochastic volatility and jumps and all kinds of other improvements in using it for features of applications you never thought of. And that's all been innovation. But if I had to point to one thing that's really kind of exciting to me is the idea that we have two things that have gone on, and I showed you it in time. We've had a great development of more and more markets for the obvious reasons. And we have, and if you think about that, markets have a manifest function. They're there for transaction. But they have a very important latent function, which is information. The market is surely imperfect, but it contains incredibly important information that's been aggregated in ways that AI is not close to doing, okay? That information no one has. No sovereign wealth fund, no central bank. They have pieces, but they don't have the core of the information. So markets provide enormous information even if you're not going to transact. That information together with technology, the ability to store things, compute things, makes data the big thing from, now everybody's saying data is big, but I'm being very specific in my mind here. Collecting huge amounts of data and very rich data from these markets. And as we get more markets, it's going to get richer. This gives, you may not call that an innovation, but to me, this gives us the power to do so much other work. If you look at one of the areas which I would say is very interesting, is household finance. It's sort of taken off now from being in the dormant stage. A lot of times they don't even teach personal finance or any of that stuff in school anymore very much. But that's taken off. In large part, I think, driven by all the data we have, we really can do things. We can surveys, but also just core data. And on the practicing side, but also on testing capital markets, we have tick-by-tick data. Every single tick trade everywhere in every market in the world is in our database. Now, if you don't do anything with it, then it's not worth anything. But just think of what that means in terms of being able to invest things. I have to say, though, and I've quit on this one, but it may sound sort of mundane, But one thing I put a plea out is, we have a real problem in finance that we can't replicate experiments literally the same way astronomers can't. You know, there's one pass of whatever the universe is, at least that we know, okay? And so there's a problem of what's called data mining, right? You run the data on the past and you find a great strategy, you find something. Well, then what do you test it on? If you test it on the same data, obviously that isn't a test, okay? It's very hard to test many things in data. So data mining is a very big problem. We don't know whether all we're doing is just, you know, look at whatever happened even randomly in the past and attributing causality to it and saying, this is what it was in the past, this is how we'll do it, all right? And we know that doesn't work very well. It's a problem. But just think of what data mining we're having and will have with AI. It looks at everything. It's the ultimate miner. It mines everything out there all over the place. And you may say, well, that's good. It's going to find out lots of things. It will find out a lot of data, but it will not, it's not clear to me how it decides any more than, if we can't decide it in concept, I don't mean we physically could do it. If we can't decide in concept a good way to get around the data mining problem, then we can't just say AI will solve it, like somehow it magically will get that. I don't see how it easily is going to solve that. Because if you look at the core of it, it's about gathering information. And you know, the old hackneyed expression is garbage in, garbage out. If you take in a bunch of bad things and you learn on it, we all know whether humans or machines, that's not a good story. And so that's that area, that whole area, from the finance point of view, not the technology point of view. Not how do I design machines that do it, but really, how do we even deal with data mining, which is going to be very big.
Okay. Okay, yeah, my second question is, maybe this also has to do with the distinction between the tools and the applications that you alluded to in my previous question, but do you do you feel that the recent rapid development of AI-driven algorithmic trading that might increase systemic risks because the AI might figure out where the weak spots in the systems are, and in order to maximize profits, push the probability of a systemic event higher? And do you think that, if so, do you think that regulation has to catch up with this new all AI development?
A very good question again. Look, algo trading, it can be very effective and very useful. You're able to better hedge positions, better trade positions, lower costs, react to information more rapidly. So it clearly is a functional thing. But I would agree, or say, that it also opens you up to more systematic risk. Whenever you have something operating at speeds very much faster than you watching it on there can even see it or understand it, and that's an act of faith. And also, there's really no backup to it. And so there is a risk that if something goes wrong, it may, for whatever reason, you're going to have big problems, because it's likely that most of the AI systems will find similar things. They may well come up to it. They'll have their own twist on it, but there is a possibility of even getting implicit coordination just by the technology itself. So these are things you need to think about. I can give you a much longer list. This is to say, not to say we shouldn't have algo trading. What it does say is that we have to recognize that they do create these risks, and we have to figure out what to do about it in terms of looking after and sustaining it. And so that's what I would say there.
Okay, thank you.
So one question, you ended your talk up talking about retirement, and it's a very important question, but there's another important question, pressing question, which is climate change.
Yes.
So how can we finance, the green transition, adaptability? In Brazil, we're launching disaster bonds.
Yeah.
So what is key for the design of these instruments and regulation?
Well, it's one of the questions of our time. And finance, here as elsewhere, is definitely, I don't know what the solution is going to be to climate change, to be clear. But what I do know is whatever those solutions are, finance is going to play a very big role in it. you're going to be a part of it. And so you're up for it. Now, there are different aspects of it. One aspect of it, as you alluded to, is how do we finance, how do we finance climate? How do we do that? We've had green bonds. We've had various experiments of kinds of bonds in an attempt to deliver lower cost, deeper pockets of funding climate change work. We also have, as you alluded to, that what finance teaches us, first, Finance 001, I think, is put the risk in the best place. And much of what finance has done to move all those things I show you is about risk and moving the risk to the right holder. Not getting rid of the risk to the world, because you can't, but putting it in the right place. It really matters. Right? So we need to develop the tools that allow us to ensure people or entities, whether institutions or companies or firms or people, to insure them against climate risk when they're not the best holders of that risk. So that's another aspect, which is different from the first one. The first one is just raising money and trying to do it. This is about building the tools to shift the risk to the best places, okay? It's not diversifiable risk. Climate change is everywhere. This is classic. It's like the market portfolio. You can't diversify it away, okay? But we can put the risks in the right place to make it more efficient. And what's the third thing? I mentioned before that there was a manifest function of markets, transactions, but the latent function is information. And I mentioned that markets have lots of very good information. There's incentives there, et cetera, to do it. We should design products or markets based on things that can be measured in terms of output, not input. You know, we lower something like, I don't know, carbon or something, but if we don't measure the amount of CO2 actually in the thing that's causing the problem in the end, we don't know whether, even though there's a relationship, how that relationship goes. You know, it's causal, correlated, who knows. But so if we can put in markets, let me be very concrete, the temperature in the ocean in South Florida, that can be measured, we understand it, and we're pretty darn sure that's a strong element of affecting climate affected things, not an element of predicting climate or a surrogate. It is the climate itself. Those fishes and those reefs are being damaged, okay? If we had those kind of markets and those prices developed, that's going to give us enormous amount of information on deciding where to put our resources and deciding what are more important or less important problems. Not that the market has all answers, but the market is a global market. People are in it are serious players, and that information will guide us on costs and benefits and say, and even we can do extraction of information to get implied probabilities. Does that mean those probabilities are correct? No, but it's an informed estimate by an incented provider of those numbers. We should use it. And that's something, if we can do that right, I think would do a lot to help us, because this is a long-run problem to solve. We are not going to solve this in 5 years or 3 years or 10, okay? So we should think of it that way, and we should think of solving it by developing the markets that will allow us particularly to make very long-run decisions on a systematic basis with best information.
Wonderful. We have time for more questions, or we are? No? 2 more questions, so please. Well, Professor Martin? Yeah. Can we have more 2 questions?
I'm sitting here. You don't see me running away yet.
So
You stay long, huh?
I guess I have a quick one. I mean, you've done, phenomenal work on risk. What's still out there for us to do on risk? Is that more adequate tools, more modeling, more or applying the data, applying the tools we have to data, or if you're studying risk right now, is that a completely different frontier like climate change? What would you study if you have to continue to write the book on risk?
Well, first, again, in my view, while finance does many things, payment systems, almost, if you think about it, most of the resources of finance, and in fact the skill sets, are all about risk and always have been. So we're going to be doing all those things. I don't think it's a choice. What I would say is, if I look back, you asked me what big events had happened. one of the biggest things that we did with risk, and this actually relates in part to the Black-Scholes model, just to put it in context of what you said, was to figure out how to build a system, real time, which allows enormous financial institutions, global banks like JP Morgan or something, very diverse, be able to monitor and manage its risk in real time or close to it. And we've done that. And we did this in a set of steps, and we're going to continue to. First, we used, and I'm taking advantage of this audience, at least those who are still sitting here. I know you're diehards, so you know what I'm talking about. The replicating principle tells us that we can look at any contract, any derivative, one-offs, right? Whole mess of them. And we can decompose it into an exposure which is equivalent to so many units of the underlying shares of Microsoft. And we do that all the time. That's enormously powerful because that means you could look at a real-world institution with all kinds of, contracts and everything. How are you ever going to aggregate that? The first step is you convert all of them into the units of the underlying. Now you have a much simpler world, and you add up all of the exposures of the bank to Microsoft. And you do it in the same unit, so you could just add it. So at the end, you say, Microsoft exposure to the bank, it's equivalent to X thousands of shares of stock. Okay? Then what do? We take each of the Microsofts, and we ask, what are their exposures? How sensitive is Microsoft to maybe 200 factors that matter to the bank? U.S. interest rates, mid-cap stocks somewhere, I don't care. The bank knows what these big aggregate risks are, factor risk, if you like. They have a big matrix of those, and on each line they have Microsoft, they have a sensitivity to that, which is expressed as, again, in the same units of dollars exposure to factor 1, to factor 2, to factor 3, and you do that for everything in the bank. And then you add up the column, and now you know your exposures to all these macro factors for the bank. If you think about that, it's amazing. It takes a lot of data, but it's done. We've been doing it. And it's dynamic, and there's nothing like it, in my view, in the world. The reason I go through that is that's where we are going, and we're going to do it much better. The idea that we could do that, if you step back and look at it, is, to my mind, rather amazing. That they could look at, this is, started with VAR, but, the idea that you could do that with institutions, and they could see where they are, and do something about it. Why? Because all their decentralized units are doing whatever they want, but when they look at the aggregate, it doesn't add up. It's like the conductor of a symphony orchestra with all the players, the violins, they're all great individually, but if you just let them play randomly themselves, you get a cacophony, not a symphony. You need someone to true up the aggregate. And that's how you do it. At the bank level, you then say, okay, we have too much exposure to this or that, adjust it at the bank level, let everything else run. I'm sorry to run through it. I don't want to make this like a class, but there's no other way I can do it. To me, I found that as an amazing that we are able to do that for real. And boy, are we going to do it better. So I can't get away from saying that should be a big enough incentive to keep you busy for a long time.
Jared, one more?
I don't have any more questions. If you want
I'll
to shoot the last
finish
one.
before handing to Rui with a suggestion rather than a question. So there's a beautiful paper called MIT and the Origins of the Modern Theory of Asset Pricing. So talking about MIT, Wiener, Professor Merton, Samuelson, and a bit about the history of finance and economic thought. So please read. Very nice paper. Rui.
Thank you very much, Arthur, Rogério, and Vinicius. And thank you so much, Professor Merton, for being here with us today. So thanks a lot, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.